If we were to define what constitutes homosexual behavior, perhaps we would quickly reach an impasse. Because not only has it been clear that homosexual behavior has been around since ages, it has also been clear that living beings at certain times change their sexual preferences in the course of a lifetime. Now, specifically talking about homosexuality is interesting, perhaps in the realm of human sexuality, because for a long time, and even to this day, a stigma has been attached to homosexuals, and therefore it has been advisable until recent times to hide one's own sexual preferences insofar as they would step into the large field that comprises homosexual behavior. Given this stigmatic effect, this challenge, which presents itself as, if one understands of himself as a homosexual, is living according to one's natural preferences, however defined, despite the obstacles encountered in a certain kind of society which discourages what one would normally or naturally aspire to. As often, humanity is contrasted with nature, also in this topic. And there has been a lot of debate concerning the question whether homosexuality is something found in nature or if it's a culture thing, the same old misleading nature-nurture debate that has plagued discussions like this without end. But it is interesting to note that in the area of our animal friends, we can witness a more mysterious conundrum, a more expressive question than in the messy area of evolutionary impulses in human societies. Because animal behavior, and especially animal reproduction, can often be traced down to evolutionary laws, which often work like clockwork in predicting what will be, homosexual behavior in animals has often been seen as a Darwinian paradox. An article which appeared in Nature Communications in 2023 describes this paradox as follows. Same-sex sexual behavior has been argued to incur higher costs than different-sex sexual behavior. First, sexual interactions with members of the same sex can have similar mating costs as sexual interactions with members of the opposite sex in terms of energy expenditure, time use, disease transmissions, injuries, etc. Second, because it does not directly contribute to reproduction, same-sex sexual behavior additionally has the opportunity cost of not producing offspring if same-sex sexual behavior occurs instead of different-sex sexual behavior. For these reasons, the evolution and prevalence of same-sex sexual behavior is often considered a Darwinian paradox. Viewed in this way, homosexual behavior in the animal kingdom is warranting an explanation, especially concerning its prevalence despite the higher costs mentioned. It should be noted that this is not a value judgment. It is not stated, as I hope is clear, that same-sex sexual behavior is in any way wrong in the direction of evolution, whatever that would mean. But there is simply the question how homosexual behavior has persisted, just like, for example, asking how the behavior of kissing has persisted from an evolutionary perspective. It is not a moral perspective that is being presented, and this is always important to empathize. Now, before we dive deeper into this interesting topic, first we have to get everyone on board about some basics about evolutionary biology. I myself am not a classical biologist, but I studied biomedicine. Still, I would say that a lot of what will be stated here in this video is probably a tad obscure for the general viewer. So the most important question, especially regarding the quote above, is what does cost mean in this case? What is fitness? Where does it come from? As you may imagine, there are thousands of definitions of what fitness actually is, and hence what evolutionary cost means in relation to fitness. But in very broad terms, fitness can be defined as a measure that reflects how well a particular type of organism or genotype can survive and take over in a competition for resources, including mates. The key idea behind it is that organisms within a population vary in their traits, and some of these variations provide advantages in the context of their environment. So let's imagine, for example, a bird being born with a slightly longer beak than its peers. The slight elongation allows the bird to reach some kind of food source in a tree hole that was previously inaccessible to its friends among the bird family. The elongated beak now presents a clear advantage in the specific environment the bird finds itself in. The bird is able to access more food, so its survival is enhanced. If we now assume that the elongation is explained by some kind of genetic trait or a combination of genetic traits, then this specific trait will be passed on to its descendants more frequently. This is what fitness is. It is an inheritable trait that provides an advantage either regarding competition for food, resources, survival itself, or competition for mates. If we talk about the competition for mates, we can also talk about what is called sexual selection, which specifically deals with how mates are chosen by one sex and how members of one sex compete with each other for access to mates of the other sex. But in general, the principle is clear. If there is a genetical trait which provides some sort of advantage in the specific environment the individual finds itself in, then this trait will be passed on more frequently, and this is how change among species and everywhere else occurs. Of course, this is a very simplified version of how evolution and natural selection occurs, but it's not meant to be more specific. Now that we have cleared this up, the problem mentioned above is a bit more clear. Does same-sex sexual behavior not diminish fitness in this regard? Does it not diminish the chances of an individual to pass on its genetical traits? This is precisely the Darwinian paradox which was mentioned above. But the article also shows that maybe same-sex sexual behavior doesn't have to be understood in this way. Maybe same-sex sexual behavior actually contributes to natural selection, just in ways that was previously not thought of. Specifically, two hypotheses are mentioned. 1. Same-sex sexual behavior contributes to establishing and maintaining positive social relationships. According to this hypothesis, same-sex sexual interactions can serve to form and maintain bonds and alliances and to facilitate reconciliation after conflicts between members of the same group. According to this hypothesis, same-sex sexual behavior should occur more in social species than in non-social ones. 2. Same-sex sexual behavior contributes to diminishing intrasexual aggression and conflict. This hypothesis postulates that same-sex sexual interactions may serve to communicate social status and establish and reinforce dominance hierarchies, thus preventing future conflicts, or may contribute to diverting aggressive behavior towards courtship behavior, providing subordinate males with greater opportunities to furtively copulate with females. Now, this hypothesis predicts that same-sex sexual behavior would occur more frequent in species who show aggressive intrasexual behavior, so aggressive behavior in one sex. As it turns out, evidence is to be found to support both of these hypotheses. The authors note that same-sex sexual behavior has been reported in more than 250 mammalian species, so it seems to be common behavior as it is frequently observed among several different species. Also, it seems to occur with similar frequencies among males and females. Interestingly, same-sex sexual behavior seems to have been gained and lost as a behavior several times during the course of mammalian evolution. In the extensive datasets the authors used, which still betrayed some limitations, it has to be noted, tests were performed to check whether same-sex sexual behavior occurs more frequently in social species and in species which displayed adulticide, taken here as indicative behavior of aggressive intrasexual behavior. While same-sex sexual behavior almost throughout all analyses showed a correlation with sociality in species, only in males was a significant correlation of same-sex sexual behavior with adulticide noted. To test whether these two evolutionary traits, same-sex sexual behavior and sociality on the one hand, same-sex sexual behavior and adulticide on the other, appeared independent of each other but with the same direction, Pagel's directional test of trait evolution was used, and it found that these traits are interdependently related. This provides evidence that the above-mentioned hypotheses about how and why same-sex sexual behavior has appeared in mammalian evolution are plausible. The fact that same-sex sexual behavior was only associated with adulticide in the male case supports rather than contradicts the above-mentioned second hypothesis. The difference between males and females in the relationship of same-sex sexual behavior with adulticide supports the hypothesis that same-sex sexual behavior has also evolved to mitigate intrasexual aggression and conflicts. This is so because adulticide in mammals seems to be the consequence of intrasexual conflicts only in males, whereas it seems to be displayed by females primarily to protect their progeny against infanticidal conspecifics. Consequently, it would be expected that if same-sex sexual behavior is a strategy directed to tempering intrasexual conflicts, this sexual behavior should be related with adulticide only in males. One limitation is that same-sex sexual behavior here is taken as temporary usage of same-sex sexual behavior. So it is not an explanation for a permanent, so to speak, sexual identity adoption of same-sex sexual behavior. But as the authors note, even taking into account this cautionary note, by using phylogenetic inference, our study may provide a potential explanation on the evolutionary history of the occurrence of same-sex sexual behavior in humans. So where does this leave us? It shows once again that things are often more complicated than they seem to be. One would initially assume same-sex sexual behavior to be a Darwinian paradox. But if one engages with the evidence, if one dares to think differently, think outside of the box, other explanations appear which also seem plausible. This is not to say that same-sex sexual behavior is explained by what has been presented in this article. But it shows that a broadening perspective often helps with questions which have been lingering for decades in the minds of scientists. While for humans the whole case is of course more complicated, also there we need to think about sexual behavior in different ways. The cultural divide and discussions of homosexuality have led to loads of suffering. And why? Because homosexuality has been taken as a sort of abnormal behavior that has to be combated for the sake of a kind of normality that has in reality never existed. And where is this normality coming from if even in the animal kingdom, disregarding the human part of it, we see what is now apparently normal same-sex sexual behavior? Even when same-sex sexual behavior there does not have to be something grinding with the knowledge about natural selection, but something that is there precisely because of it, that can be explained by normal evolution. Evolution has nothing to do with normality, taken as a moral judgment, but same-sex sexual behavior has nonetheless never been something abnormal or something against biology, whatever that would mean. At the same time, it has to be noted that sexuality is often more fluid than we think. A lot is fixed, but then behavior is shaped by so many factors, especially when it comes to sexual behavior, that anything is possible, even after a long time of consistently acting in the same manner. The idea, which the authors of the presented article note, of categories of sexual beings makes sense in some way, but in a lot of ways it doesn't, because sexual behavior changes, just as my face changes, and just as my manner changes, even if there is something I would call a core of who I am. But this core is an illusion of mine, which I have so to group my behavior, which can be contradictory and which can sometimes be perfectly consistent in a way so as to enable me to tell a story about my being. But all stories are fictions in some ways. So also my category of being a sexual being is more fluid and less solid than one often is led to think.